Welcome to the Higher Power Podcast, presented by Higher Power Sports PT, the show dedicated to helping active individuals like you unlock your full potential through expert insights on injury prevention, performance enhancement, and recovery. Kurt Kessler is a board-certified specialist in sports physical therapy and an athletic trainer. In each episode, he and his guests bring you the latest evidence-based strategies to help you move better, feel stronger, and stay injury-free. Let's learn together.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Higher Powered Podcast. Today is part 2 of our nutrition series with Angie Dye. Today we're going to talk more specifics on sports nutrition. So Angie is returning to continue our nutrition mini-series, and I would encourage listeners to go back and listen to the previous episode with her because we went deep on a lot of topics. I went on many tangents, and I think it's a good piece for education. All right, going into sports nutrition here, Angie. So how does nutrition and hydration influence performance in athletes?
I think it has a pretty big influence on athletes. It's really kind of the gas in the tank for your optimal sports vehicle, right? If your fluids and your gas tank aren't filled up, you're not going to perform your best. So I think it's a pretty integral part of sports performance and recovery to be on top of hydration and nutrition.
So when talking specifically about fueling for performance, you throw this performance word out there and everyone's ears perk up.
Yeah.
How do I get better at what I'm doing?
Yes.
So fueling for performance, what should athletes, and I know this might look different for different sports,
Yes.
but in general, what should athletes be eating before, during, after exercise, and how does that influence maybe their performance or how they're feeling while they're performing?
Yes, and you're exactly right. There's, so many different types of athletes out there, and it is going to vary on your sport. The length of your practice or performance is going to kind of alter all of that to your personal needs. But in general, we like to think of really having muscle glycogen stores really topped up before we go to train or to perform in a race or in a game. So what that means is not only is this like what you're eating immediately before your workout, but what you're eating in days leading up to these things is important for having those glycogen stores kind of primed and ready to go. So primarily that would be carbohydrate foods before workouts. So things that are, if it's close to when you're working out, things that are pretty easily digested, more of these sort of quick acting carbohydrates are optimal to have if you're pretty close to your workout. Maybe I think of high school athletes and having that 30 minutes right after school's out before practice starts to get in, usually between at least 30 to 60 grams of easily digested carbohydrates will kind of prime you to perform your best in most sports. Again, this is going to vary from sport to sport. Within the workout, again, this is or performance, this is going to vary. If it's something short, maybe an hour or less, most athletes will be fine if their nutrition is kind of topped up coming in to just really stay hydrated during that session. For longer sessions, things that are more than 90 minutes or kind of beyond, this is where we might think about supplementing with carbohydrates, fluids, electrolytes within the workout. After the workout, this is sort of where we think of starting the repair process. So we do want to replenish those carbohydrates that we've used in the workout, but also pair that with some high quality protein, fruits, vegetables, fats for satiety. So again, it's going to kind of vary between athletes, but that's sort of the backbone of what we should be thinking about for pre, during, and post.
The next topic here, we kind of hit on at the end of part 1, but I want to tailor this a little bit more for the active individual or the athlete. So the roles that carbs, fats, and proteins play specifically for athletes or more intense training. So you mentioned that carbs are the fuel source. Can you just take me through each one of those macronutrients and how it ties specifically into athletes, or what each of these things help accomplish in the body as it pertains to sport?
Yes. So carbohydrates are just going to be our primary energy source for anything really in that kind of aerobic or anaerobic range that we're kind of utilizing carbohydrates in those activities. So, having a nice amount of carbohydrates in your regular eating is really important for all types of athletes. Again, this is going to kind of vary from athlete to athlete, but that's the primary thing you're using when you're sprinting, when you're swimming, when you're lifting. Those, all those body systems are using carbohydrates as the primary energy source. Protein, I think the message is kind of out there. I don't think this is like a news flash that protein is kind of helping with if our athletic goals are to build muscle, to repair muscle, to repair an injury. Protein is really, really important for all of those processes. But I think what I'm seeing has been a little bit of a trend is such a focus on protein that carbs get skimped on a bit. So yes, protein is important. Yes, it helps with recovery and repair and muscle growth, but none of that can happen without carbohydrates also being present. And then fat, sometimes the major thing that fat helps to do in athletes is just to provide enough energy for some of these sports that are, really high caloric output. Fats provide a concentrated source of energy that helps athletes meet their needs. Also, kind of sustaining cellular health, hormone health, these kinds of things. So having, a balance of those three macronutrients for sport is really important based on what kind of sport you're doing or what your performance or maybe even body composition goals are. If that's a sport specific concern, those macronutrients might look different, but all really play an important role for athletes.
Yeah, I don't think there's any secret that, protein is helpful for muscles, especially after training. But I like that you said that sometimes it's coming at the expense of carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
So I always, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that I've always looked at this is like if we're way high on one versus the other, like our body can use it for certain things, but it might not be the most efficient way.
Mm-hmm.
For example, our body uses carbohydrates for that fuel. Our bodies can use protein in that way, but it really takes a lot of extra steps
Yes.
to get it to where it needs to go. And then it just ends up being really inefficient.
Yes.
That's that has been my understanding of it.
Yes.
And then as far as like timing of some of these
Mm-hmm.
things, can you talk about timing of when some of these different macronutrients are helpful, and then maybe give some examples of types of food so that listeners can try to potentially apply some of these practical food choices depending on their timing?
Well, I think working with so many athletes over the years, this is something that is always a little bit of a balancing act, right? I have a lot of athletes that like to get up super early in the morning and train, and that's the only time that they can really get in maybe an hour session or a 2 hour session, which sometimes that means waking up at 4:30 or 5 a.m. So eating a really robust, high carbohydrate meal that early in the morning can be difficult. If none of us had jobs and all we had to do was, train or we could schedule our whole days around that. Ideally, it's nice to eat maybe an hour and a half or an hour before training to really let some digestion start to take place. And if the timing is a little farther out from your activity, those meals could include a little bit of, you want it to be primarily carbohydrate, but it can have some protein and some fat. The closer we get to a workout, the better it is to have it be primarily easy digested carbohydrate and kind of leave the fat and the protein for after the workout. So an example of that might be, let's say you have a, Saturday morning long run. If you have time to wake up and have some eggs and a waffle and some syrup and some berries and had 2 hours to digest that, that would be great pre-run fuel. But if you're getting up and going to be out running in 45 minutes, that's where shifting that to maybe we get rid of the eggs, we do 2 waffles, a little bit more syrup, maybe a banana, all things that are much more easy to digest that aren't going to be kind of sloshing around and giving the gut more work to digest while you're out running.
I love drawing parallels between what you're saying and what I do because again, there's so much stuff out there. There's so much misinformation out there. Like everyone's trying to sell this like one size fits all type of approach or follow this meal plan for these results or follow this exercise plan for these results. If you have shoulder pain, do these 3 exercises and it'll cure it all. We're all made different. We all have different movement patterns. We all have different activities. We all have different beliefs around exercise or food or whatever it is. And so that's where I just urge people that if you're looking for something specific, if you're looking for a specific solution, whether that's exercise or nutrition or whatever it may be, like find the provider that is able to just come alongside of you and guide you to where you want to be. And like there's so much nuance in every profession, especially in the healthcare system. So like just getting lined up with the correct provider can just go such a long way. And again, we talk about efficiency, like just be more efficient in getting you where you want to go. Spend less time, less visits, less whatever when you get to the right provider. So shifting gears here, speaking specifically about nutrition for recovery. Now, the big like low-hanging fruit, mainstream stuff, we talked about protein after you eat, but the more I listen to like dietitians that work with professional teams or whatever, like the recovery process starts like the minute the game is over. And specifically, we all influence performance within the scope of our own professions. So in nutrition and dietetics, what are some ways that people can optimize their recovery with nutrition? And maybe, you know, you can touch on the protein aspect, but maybe some of the other things that people may not have heard of.
Yes, I think the protein has kind of been beat into all of us, but kind of thinking about that recovery window as not something that slams shut per se, but something that if we think about getting in while that window is still really nice and open, we can start that recovery process. So if, you know, you've really worked hard, you know, you've gone and you've done a really heavy lift and you've hit that last rep and you've gone up on your weight and you've had this amazing workout, just sort of thinking about finishing that workout by really trying to get in carbohydrates and protein and calories after that workout. That's just really going to help those muscles repair and recover to get all of the benefit from that hard session that you have just done. I think sometimes we do that hard session, we're tired, we're sweaty, we have an errand to run. So we think of like 10 other things that we can do besides getting started on the recovery nutrition process. So whether it's, you know, super high protein, moderate protein, it doesn't really matter as much of getting in the habit of having some fuel coming in after the workout. Of things that maybe people haven't heard, I don't really know. I would say maybe with kind of where we are now of thinking of how hot it is, of how important it is to think about hydration after a workout. I know this morning I went out for not even a very long run, but was just soaked when I came home and salty. And so, you know, that's something I've been more mindful of having good things to kind of start the rehydration process, you know, prioritizing what I'm going to eat and drink within that kind of half an hour, 45-minute window that I get home to kind of really start on that. So if that's not something you're in the habit of doing, if it's something that does get kind of pushed off or thought of as not as important as what you're doing in the gym or what you're doing on the field, that food and that hydration afterward is really just going to get you more and more of the benefit of all that training that you just did.
I want to like dip my big toe into a rabbit hole.
Okay.
As we're talking about recovery. So, you know, there are many, or I shouldn't say many, there are 4 pillars of recovery. We touch on those more in episode 3 with Sarah Neal, and sleep being a big one.
Hmm.
So sleep is the time where our body does all of this repairs and million health benefits from sleep. But from the nutrition side of sleep, so I listened to a presentation, I believe is one of the dietitians with the Phillies, who introduced my mindset or my brain to the idea of like tart cherry juice and things that will aid in sleep. Any thoughts improving sleep with nutrition? I didn't prepare you for this
No,
one.
no, that's okay. I do. I mean, tart cherry juice might be one of my favorites in that area just because it's tasty and it's an easy thing to kind of add to your routine. And some of the studies around tart cherry juice do show it almost has a similar anti-inflammatory effect to like taking a, aspirin or a Advil kind of thing. So that is a nice one. I would say, I was just having this conversation this morning with an athlete of thinking about, a bedtime snack actually can help with sleep. I think there's so much um, information out there about, the kitchen closes at 7 and we really need to, rest our guts this whole time, and eating late at night can disrupt our sleep. And certainly there are things that it can be true. My athletes with reflux, I really like to give them 2 hours, 3 hours before eating a meal and laying down. But a lot of my athletes, my teen athletes, sometimes they'll be going to bed hungry, and that will interrupt your sleep more than any bedtime snack will. So I think for growing athletes, for people who are kind of in my triathlon world, long course triathlon, it's pretty common to need another snack kind of close to bedtime. And things that can kind of help with recovery while you're sleeping are some of those things that contain the slower digesting casein protein. So cottage cheese, pretty polarizing, but that can be, a really nice bedtime snack if you've had a hard training day and want to have some, muscle recovery while you're sleeping. But kind of just getting in one more mini meal a little bit closer to bed can actually help with sleep, if as opposed to going to bed hungry, which I find some athletes feel like they should do, but it can really be detrimental to sleep.
Yeah. And you briefly mentioned a little bit about inflammation. So I just want to say the role of inflammation in our body is very important, because that process, that inflammatory process, brings nutrients to the tissues to help repair it.
Hmm.
But it's when we get this chronic inflammation where, it's almost like the inflammation shows up for the party, but then ends up staying the
Yeah.
night type of deal. That's when we run into some pain or some tendon changes or whatever it may be.
Hmm.
So, any thoughts on nutrition for combating inflammation, like maybe either after an event or after an injury?
Yeah, I think inflammation is a pretty big buzzword now. Particularly, we've been talking about social media influencers today. I think they love that word. They love to scare us with that. We're all inflamed and we need to eliminate all these inflammatory foods, or we just have this vision that we're walking around all hot and red and bubbly when really when really, to your point, some of these things really can kind of help these metabolic adaptations that we're looking for. So, to get, really sore muscles after a heavy lift, that's a little inflammation, and you can, repair that with hydration and nutrition and rest and all of these things. But that's where you're getting some of those adaptations. So I think first and foremost, don't have so much fear around inflammation that it's causing you to be inflamed with worry. But certainly things like, again, thinking about that recovery window and not sleeping on that too much, of, really thinking about getting in adequate fluids and adequate foods after events. And then injuries, I think what I see a lot with injuries is sometimes athletes in particular will get scared to keep eating when they're injured. They think, oh gosh, I was needing all of this energy when I was in season. Now I'm sidelined with this. I better watch it. And really, you need that good nutrition coming in, even when you are sidelined with something. So certainly a protein focus is going to be helpful. But again, protein can't do its job without carbohydrates and fat, not getting sucked into that almost diet culture mindset of that your training is down or maybe stopped entirely. You're still a robust athlete that needs nutrients during that time. So kind of, maybe that's a time that you can focus on if you're not a great fruit and vegetable eater, or if you are relying on a lot of processed foods. These are times where you could, sort of make some tweaks to try to even optimize it, but it's not a time to batten down the hatches and go on some 1400 calorie blah blah plan that's not going to help heal from an injury.
Yeah, and I just want to add my 2 cents in on that, because you talked about with injuries, sometimes the mindset is, oh, well, I'm not exercising as much because of this injury, so I better cut back on what I'm eating. Some of the education that I provide to patients, especially ones that are going into a surgery, like whether it's total knee
Hmm.
or a major repair of some sort, rotator cuff, whatever. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the body, a couple of things, the repair process, or the process of healing, requires a certain amount of energy from our body.
Hmm.
So if we're restricting our calories, we're actually not giving our body the fuel it needs to make these repairs. And then also, like, your body is going to get that energy from somewhere.
Hmm.
So if you're not having enough protein, if you're not giving yourself enough carbohydrates for that fueling, your body's going to start stealing it from your
Hmm.
muscles, and it's going to start breaking down your muscles, and it's going to be even harder to build strength, or it's going to take longer to build up your muscle capacity to get you back to returning to sport. So again, there are just so many different considerations that we have around injury, whether it's, nutrition, or on my side, like the rehab part. Now, like, I don't make specific recommendations for what people need or should eat or how much they should, but just I provide the education within my scope of practice that we don't want to be cutting calories when we're injured to a certain extent, especially if there's major healing that's going on.
Absolutely. Sing it from the rooftops.
All right, so let's go fairly surface level here. If you want to come back and take a deeper dive on some of these topics, you're always welcome.
Okay.
But I want to talk about some specific considerations. You yourself are an endurance athlete. Any specific considerations nutrition-wise for someone who is going to be running long distances or biking long distances, or gosh, you can even say, like, now this might be higher level tennis where these matches can go
Hmm.
3, 4, 5 hours, but sports that require a lot of endurance, what considerations do we have for that?
It's just going to really up your total energy requirements a lot more than you may think. Sometimes, in triathlon, nutrition is often called like the fourth discipline. There's swimming, there's biking, there's running, there's nutrition. If that part is difficult for a lot of endurance athletes. I remember kind of finishing up my training cycle for Ironman Florida, and I was just actually tired of eating because if that training volume required so much food, and I love food, so for me to say that, that's really something. So I think a lot of athletes in endurance type of sports, sometimes endurance training, long runs or long swims or long bikes, some athletes will get a blunting effect of their appetite with that. So others will be very, very hungry, and it's intuitive and it's easy to eat a lot. But just knowing that pure hunger or eating just when you're hungry may not be enough for some of these sports that are very long and really have a high caloric output with them, that nutrition may need more planning and sometimes scooping extra food when you don't always feel like it.
Yeah. So let's swing the pendulum to the other side of
Hmm.
endurance for athletes. So thinking more power athletes, whether that's Olympic weightlifters or powerlifters, or I was going to say football players, but there's still some endurance component to that. But sports where you are doing quick bursts of intense exercise for potentially a shorter duration. Any thoughts surrounding that?
Of course, the sports are quite different, but a lot of times the nutrition component can be pretty similar. I think sometimes we think of weightlifting and bodybuilding and powerlifting and these kinds of things, and our brains go to protein. But all of those activities, those quick bursts of energy, those are using carbohydrates as well. So I see sometimes in that lifting community that these sort of high protein or high fat, low carb diets get promoted. And that's a little bit more for a physique type of outcome than really for powering those intense short bursts. That's again carbohydrates. So you want that to be a pretty important integral part of any kind of power um, nutrition plan.
And then the last group of people that I want to discuss is the vegan or vegetarian athlete. This becomes interesting because when you think of these groups, it tends to be a little bit hard to get protein because animal sources typically tend to be the easiest or most available ways to get that portion of the diet. But what considerations do you have for this population?
I think just knowing that it is very possible to be incredibly healthy and get everything you need with a vegetarian diet. When you're talking about vegan and excluding all animal products, it does get a little trickier. Again, completely possible, but this isn't something you can just sort of pick up as a habit. I'm going to try eliminating all of these foods and see how I feel. So that is one place where sometimes that is good to sit down with a professional and just to see what kinds of things you might need to supplement to your normal diet, whether that's protein, whether that's B12, whether that's omega-3, lots of things that can be missing from a vegetarian or vegan diet, but it is entirely possible to do that. It just isn't as easy as when you're eating all of the different food groups and have access to things like animal protein for easy protein sources.
Yeah, and I think it's easily overlooked when someone makes the choice to go vegan or vegetarian, um, because someone who makes that choice has motivations behind
Hmm.
it. One, like on one hand, we can respect that and give them resources to make sure that they're giving their body what they need with this lifestyle choice, but also just like if this is you, if you're currently, practicing this type of eating lifestyle, or if you're considering it, like just know that there are specific considerations that one, we can work on to help your performance, or two, prevent some of these other breakdowns of the system or breakdowns along the way that can happen with improper nutrition.
Hmm.
So, if this is you, just make sure that you're finding high quality information so that you can take care of yourself as best as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
The last topic to get in here for athletes is supplementation. So again, we're exhausting the social media influencer bad portions of the internet
Yes.
as we talk about nutrition information. So it's hard to know what's true, what's valid, but what are some key nutrients, or what are some, even just, I don't even want to push you in a certain direction, but what's your mindset or what is your thought process around supplementation that could be or could not be of valuable to, or could or could not be of value to athletes?
Yeah, I think, when I was going through training back in the 90s, a lot of the mantra was food first. You can get everything you need with food. The supplement industry was much smaller than it is now, with, to your point, not as big of a reach because social media wasn't around back then now. So, gosh, just because we're talking about this, probably the next time we go and check our social media, we're going to have ads for creatine, omega-3s, joint health, collagen, whatever else. But I think we are just kind of bombarded by that now. And there are really good products that can be helpful. But I would say making sure that you're talking to your healthcare team. If you have a primary care physician and you're thinking about a supplement, that's a good person to ask. If you're working with a CSSD like me, I can help with, would these supplements be helpful? Could you get these things from food? Or are there things that you can't get from food that would be incredibly helpful? Some of the things I think about along those lines are, we're in Pennsylvania. I don't know about you if you've ever had your vitamin D checked. I can't remember if we talked about that, but a lot of my athletes are vitamin D deficient or low. So I that is kind of one thing I usually recommend. Can we get our athletes checked, their vitamin D levels checked? And if it's low, it's a very easy thing to supplement with. I do have different brands of higher quality supplements that I like to recommend versus just maybe what's in your Instagram feed or what you see at the grocery store. Creatine is another one that there's so much research around, and it is something that is difficult to get enough of unless you're eating 2 or 3 pounds of meat. Maybe the carnivore diet or people do fine with creatine, but otherwise there's a lot of good information. It's a very well studied supplement, benefits for both power and endurance athletes, men and women, young or old. So there are certain things that kind of always come up as topics, I think, of supplements for athletes, but it is good to think about, why are you using it? Could I get this from food? Could I get this from somewhere else? Is it safe? Could this harm my performance? Could this have a banned substance in it? Could this get me into trouble? These are all kind of things I have people think about when they're thinking about a supplement.
You're stealing the thoughts right out of my
Oh,
mind.
no.
So, so what? So you said, oh my, now as quickly as it was, you literally stole it out of my mind. I can't think of what I was going to say.
Can you get
now.
it from food?
Okay, so from one end, so like the banned substances stuff, like a lot of these supplements are almost, I don't know, not many of these supplements are FDA regulated. So like one, you should be, if you're planning on taking some of this stuff, you should be checking in with your athletic trainer, sports physical therapist on like the specific banned substances in certain sports. But with most of these supplements not being regulated by the FDA, is there anything on the label that would validate effectiveness or the quality of product that, consumers should be looking for?
Yeah, for general supplements like a multivitamin, or vitamin D, like I mentioned, B vitamins, different things like that, there's a little yellow label that's on quite a few supplements that says USP, that stands for United Standard Pharmacopoeia. And what that means is that supplement company has paid, I think, a few $100,000 to have a third party company come in and independently test that, yes, in this multivitamin is calcium, iron, B vitamins, these things, and not, asparagus dust or other things that have sort of shown up in some of these supplements. So the USP label is very good thing to look for kind of general supplements. Since this podcast is about athletes, one thing I like to have my athletes download is the NSF app. That's kind of seeing that certification on your creatine or your electrolytes or your protein powders. Like these things, if you are a college athlete who's tested, that's just going to ensure that protein powder, creatine, whatever it is that you're taking is safe for you as an athlete. It's not going to contain banned substances, and it's not going to be something that gets you, sidelined for eligibility for testing positive for something like that. So that NSF app is really nice to kind of plug in some of the things that you're interested in to see if they are safe for sport.
Well, when I'm editing this podcast, I know there's going to be stuff that I'm going to kick myself for not following up on, but it's just not coming to me. But I think all the information that you provided is such quality information. I myself, I'm thankful for your time. I'm thankful that you have this passion and want to share this knowledge with, anybody that it can help. For anybody who's looking for you, can we talk about where to find you one more time?
Yes, my website is the best way to kind of connect with me and see what's going on. I publish a monthly blog there, so that's kind of a nice way to keep in touch. But my website is carpediemnutrition.com. I'm also a little bit on Instagram at carpediemrdn, but not as active on there as I try to keep my website up to date.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate not even just this conversation, but being such a resource for me, even before I personally met you, your reputation in the central Pennsylvania area has really preceded you to the point where I was referring people to you before I even met you. And now, like, anybody who has nutrition questions for me, I'm like, Angie, she's the one.
Oh,
So
that's so
thank you so
sweet.
much.
Thank you, Kurt. That means a lot. I appreciate it.
All right, that's going to do it for our mini series on nutrition. Thank you for everybody who for listening. If anything we said resonates with you and you want to follow up, you can find my information in the show notes or find me on Instagram at Higher Power Sports PT. And we'll see you next time.
That's a wrap for today's episode of the Higher Powered Podcast, presented by Higher Powered Sports PT. We hope you gained valuable insights on how to stay strong, move better, and prevent injury, all backed by expert knowledge in sports physical therapy and athletic training. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us bring more evidence-based tips and strategies to active individuals just like you. For more resources or to connect with us, head over to hpsportspt.com. That's hpsportspt.com. Remember, you've got the power to perform at your best. Keep training smarter, recovering faster, and living stronger. Just a reminder that the content shared in this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional before making any changes to your health or treatment plan. Thanks for tuning in. We hope to see you next time on the Higher Powered Podcast.